This lecture is on early Netherlandish art. And we're starting off with the 15th century art in the lowlands. And you'll remember from the lecture that we had previously on early Netherlandish background that we're using that word Netherlandish to refer to countries that are near or at sea level. Today, they would be the Kingdom of the Netherlands, would be the North Netherlands, and Belgium would be Flanders. Flanders is part of Belgium, which would be the southern Netherlands. So we're going to talk about some artists that came from the Netherlands. And they actually went down and worked in France. Later, we'll be talking about artists who live and work in Flanders. But first, let's do some generalizations. Let's talk about some characteristics of early Netherlandish painting. And you'll see we have style, medium, and iconography here. Early Netherlandish painting is known for the naturalistic detail. The example you saw in the introduction is Jan van Eyck, and we're going to be talking about Jan van Eyck in some detail soon. So they're showing details of the visible world and often the textures of the surfaces, such as brocades or jewels or things that look extremely real. Jan van Eyck developed a type of painting. He used oil paint on panel, and he did it with such perfect accomplishment that for centuries, starting in the 16th century, with Vasari's Lives of the Artist, which we'll hear about later, they used to say that Jan van Eyck invented oil paint. Well, that's not true. Oil paint is mentioned actually centuries before Jan van Eyck, but his technique attracted a lot of attention and gave him this wonderful reputation. Other Netherlandish artists and other artists in Northern Europe then tried to imitate that. And probably Jan van Eyck used more layers of glazes and was the pinnacle of this type of art. But in general, most early Netherlandish artists and most surviving paintings from Flanders are painted with oil paint on panel. Now, when we say panel, we mean wood. And generally, it's oak. And they've actually established that it's oak that was imported from what today would be Poland, from Baltic areas. Now, what was this technique that was used? Well, you would start with your wooden panel with the frame already on it, which you've ordered from the carpenter, either a standard form or something that you've designed, as the artist. And generally, your apprentices would seal the wood with the gesso or chalk or something. And then you have a smooth white surface to paint on. You would probably do your underdrawing, often in some kind of charcoal medium, which if you've heard, when they do that, then sometimes we can use infrared reflectography to see the underdrawings today. But anyway, the artist wasn't planning that. They didn't have any idea anybody would ever be able to see those. So they do their design, and then they'd start to build up the colors with oil glazes. Now, a glaze is when you have less pigment and more oil. Okay, let's talk about paint. Paint consists of color, which we call pigment, And at this time, it's all natural pigments. There are no synthetic pigments in the 15th century. So they're either made from minerals or occasionally from vegetable matter, such as rose madder. And you would grind these up into a powder. And then you mix it with oil, which is either linseed oil or nut oil. And of course, you can thin it with turpentine. Or you could add more oil and less pigment, and it becomes translucent. And if you pour more pigment and less oil, it becomes opaque. So when it is translucent, when you're using a smaller amount of pigment, of color, in your oil vehicle, as they call it, in your oil, you're creating an oil glaze. And you apply that, and you let it dry. The 16th century, the Italians talk about the secret of oil paint. Well, the secret is to let it dry completely. Because if you add another layer and it's still tacky, then the colors can kind of mix and get muddy. So you have your layer of oil glaze and you let it dry. And then you can put another layer and let it dry, and another layer. And what happens is, because these glazes are translucent, you can make very rich colors by building up with the same hue, or you could alter the colors, the hues, somewhat by using somewhat different hues. Maybe you want light blue at one place and a darker blue at another. But remember, it's a glaze. It's made out of oil. And light can shine on oil, and as you know, light reflects off of oil. But also, because you're using these layers of glaze, the light can penetrate the layers. And this gives it an incredible luminosity. It's both light reflective and, the light can penetrate the surfaces. And so, if you have a well-preserved painting by one of the artists who have used this technique, it's luminous. Unfortunately, of course, some of the layers sometimes are rubbed off over time in being abraded throughout the ages, as it were. But it creates a beautiful luminosity, and it creates very, very rich colors. Okay. Now, I don't want you to think that every single painting was oil paint on panel. There are examples of tempera paint and tempera on canvas or linen, but those seem to be relatively rare. Part of it's survival. They may not have survived as well, but quite possibly, more paintings were made on panel. Or they may have been they were more expensive when they were on panel. So these may have been the more prized ones as well. It's possible. The same thing is true when I say that they're known for Christian religious subjects. I don't mean that's the only subject they ever painted, but the vast majority of surviving works of art from the 15th century in the lowlands are Christian religious subjects. Now, is that just because that's what happened to survive, because they were considered to be holy paintings and they preserved them? That may be partially true. We know that secular art, for example, just think about it. Somebody remodels your palace or your castle, or it's old-fashioned. Let's paint over these older paintings, or let's throw out that old-fashioned stuff. They may have felt like that. But we also think that there probably were more paintings in service to the Christian religion at this time. And you'll find that's one of the great motivators, one of the great reasons or functions of art from this period. The other type of art that survives is often portraiture. we do have a number of portraits, and presumably there were many, many more portraits that existed that do not survive. We always have to deal with questions of survival when it has been hundreds and hundreds of years since the works were created. Okay, so different Christian religious subjects. Some are used liturgically. In other words, they're on altarpieces, on altars, used as part of the rites and the rituals, the liturgy of the church. Others might be for personal devotion. Okay. So I'm just saying some things that these may include are strong emotion. Now, with Roger van der Weyden, you often see the strong emotion of Christ and his followers suffering with him as Christ is crucified and dies. Some artwork, as we said, much of it is liturgical artwork. It's altar pieces used in the church, but there also are works of art that have a personal devotional function. They're used for private devotions. And we believe that in many cases, these very naturalistic objects that appear in the rooms with the holy figures are used as symbols. And we're going to discuss that. There is a controversy about some. There are works of art that many people say, oh yes, this is symbolic, and someone else will say, no, it isn't. So how do you decide? Well, there's no foolproof method. But we will discuss the possibility that certain objects are symbols, and what things are definitely symbols. I mean, there are some things that nobody does disagree with. There are certain standard symbols that we see over and over again in art. Well, we don't have just early Netherlandish painting. We also have some early Netherlandish sculpture, and in fact, that's what we're going to start with. And the same things are true except for the medium. These artists would use naturalistic detail. They use Christian subject matter, and sometimes portraiture. But of course, they're not painting with the oil paint. They are carving in wood or stone. Different kinds of stone are used, limestone, sandstone, alabaster are used in Netherlandish and German art from the 15th and 16th centuries. Most of these were painted. It wouldn't have been the sculptor who would have painted them unless he had a mastership in both painting and sculpture. It would have been a painter. So the sculptor would create the work, and then a painter would be hired to paint it in most cases. There is an exception. Now, this is in German art at the late 15th century. An artist named Tilman Riemenschneider starts not having his wooden sculpture painted. Some of it is, and some of it is not. And that is a whole new aesthetic, as it were. But the artwork we're going to talk about today was originally painted. And the first artist we're going to talk about, his name was Claus Sluter. So you can call him Sluter. His first name is Claus. He does have a last name. And he comes from the North Netherlands. We think he was born in Haarlem. Yeah, he comes from Haarlem. And different archival documents show that he lived in Brussels for a while. And then he moved down to Dijon. This is Dijon in Burgundy, in France, which would be north and south. It would be about in the center, but over in the east, sort of east central France. And there are three works of art that are his primary works, and they're all associated with the same patron, who was the Duke of Burgundy. And Claus Sluter came down from the North Netherlands. He came to work for the Duke of Burgundy, who at that time was Philip the Bold. And he worked on sculpture for the Chartreuse du Champ-Mal. Now, that's not chartreuse a color. Chartreuse here means Carthusian. And this was a Carthusian monastery that was founded by the Duke. And so he was paid out vast sums of money to have it built and decorated. And then it was a double Carthusian monastery, which I need to explain. The Carthusians were a very austere, religious, monastic order. And unlike, for example, the Benedictines, who had an order where they were supposed to work and pray, the Carthusians were supposed to pray. And so if you have a Carthusian monastery, you have to really endow it well. Probably give it lands and serfs and people to support these monks who are spending all their time praying, or are supposed to be spending all their time praying. Most Carthusian monasteries only have 12 monks, but this one was double. It had 24 monks. And their job was to pray, and specifically to pray for the souls of the Duke and his wife and their family. So the purpose of the monastery and all of the art was to save the Duke's soul. And you'll find that very often art is related to this idea of salvation. This is, true. We're talking here about Christian art of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And of course, you could call this either late medieval or Renaissance or early Renaissance, either one. Just to keep things simple, we're calling it Renaissance. The sculpture we're going to look at by Claus Sluter has a conventional name. Today we call it the Well of Moses. And it dates from about 1393, when he starts working on it, to 1401. So for our purposes, let's just call it circa, around, approximately, 1400. And that's a pretty easy date to remember. These were sculpture that decorated the fountain at the Chartreuse du Champ-Mal, at this Carthusian monastery. And what you see is a basin where the monks would get their water. And in the center is a very elaborate sculpture. What we have surviving today is the base. And this shows Old Testament prophets. You see Moses is one of them right here. Next to him, the figure that you can see part of is on the right, your right, is David, and there are other prophets shown. And then once, it's now been destroyed, up above, you had Christ hanging on the cross with the Virgin Mary and St. John the Evangelist on either side. So it was an extremely elaborate sculpture. And you can also see these angels right below the cornice, standing on top of these very thin little columns. And the angels are mourning the death of Christ. We'll see a detail of them later. Here, you're seeing a few more, another view. And one of the surviving fragments of the head of Christ. And you can see this is very naturalistic. All of these forms look very, very real. Now, I want to talk about the iconography for a minute. this isn't a painting of the Well of Moses, but the iconography is similar. And the top of it is probably similar in a sense. It's not copied from it or anything like that. This painting dates from about a century later. It's called The Fountain of Life. And as you can see, you have a large basin, a large, is it a fountain or well? But a large basin there with Christ. The cross of Christ rising out of it, Christ hanging on the cross, and his blood is flowing into the basin. And you can see, because this is in color, that it's the water, if you will, is really blood. It's really, or the blood of Christ is there. Now, the reproduction is too small to see it, but on the edge of the basin it says Fons Vitae, fountain of life. And you can see Mary is standing on one side of Christ and John on the other. But this isn't a realistic crucifixion scene. The figures that surround the basin are people from all walks of life. Presumably, possibly the patrons are right there in the front. But they aren't the people who would have been present at Christ's actual crucifixion. These are people dressed in 16th century, early 16th century, late 15th, early 16th century clothing, and they have come to adore Christ. So this work of art is theological and in nature. It's saying something beyond the narrative of this is what it was like when Christ died. It's not really saying that. It's talking about Christ's death as sacrificial. He dies to save mankind from their sins. We'll hear more about this later because it's very relevant to many works of art. And it also refers to the sacrament of the Mass, because it was believed, and it still is, by many Christians, particularly Catholics, that the bread and wine of the sacrament known as the Eucharist or Holy Communion in some way is transformed into the true body and blood of Christ. And it is also believed, once again, at this time, by virtually everybody who was, obviously there were some minority religions such as Jews who were alive at the time, but by most of the people in Europe at this time, and still, by many Christians today, though not all of them, that the sacrifice of the Eucharist or the Mass is a saving sacrifice, that it reenacts the crucifixion of Christ in a bloodless manner. He doesn't suffer again, but it's reenacting that, and it creates merits that help save people's souls. It helps to atone for or make up for their sins. As I say, we'll explain this later. And maybe this is a good time for me to say it. Some of you will be saying, you're doing an awful lot of Christian, or some of you will say, an awful lot of Catholic iconography and theology. Well, I have to. This is history. And the works of art that we're showing in class, some of the great works of art of history, religion is one of the main functions of artwork. It's one of the main reasons they were created. And so if you look at a work of art and I say to you, I can't talk about religion, so I won't tell you what this work meant, and I can't tell you where it is or where it was or what it was created for, well, that's falsifying history, isn't it? I'm not telling you that you have to believe this. I'm telling you that this is what the people who commissioned the work of art believed. This is what was prevalent in the society from which the work of art comes. And, if I try to change it to somebody else's ideas, then that would falsify history. So when you're learning history, you're going to learn a lot about different religions. Take it as a learning experience. When you are doing your non-Western art quizzes and you're reading those chapters, you'll learn about different religions. But much of the great art of Europe and of the Western world was created in relationship to the Christian religion, and much of it was created in relationship to Catholicism. So to explain and to discuss the works of art, I must discuss the theology and the uses of these works of art. But no, you don't have to believe it. It's just understand that this is history. Okay? Back to the Well of Moses, which probably had a very similar meaning. You have this idea of the fountain of life, the idea that Christ is atoning for the sins of mankind. But what about the prophets? No, that's it. Christ is atoning for the sins of mankind. And then you have the angels who are mourning the death of Christ. But then you have the prophets. What are they doing there? Well, historically, Christianity has had I would say almost an ambiguous, a very strange relationship with Judaism. Christianity comes out of Judaism. All of the earliest Christians were Jews, as was Christ, Jesus of Nazareth. And yet, in subsequent centuries, and during the Middle Ages, Christians often took always, and during the Middle Ages I'll say, took extremely negative views of Jews and Judaism, and often actively persecuted and even killed people for being Jews. There were periods when they lived side by side, but there were other times in which, for example, a mob would break out and go and wreak violence and havoc. So, as I say, there's this very ambiguous relationship. How did the Christians look at it? Well, they looked at it as though the Jews were where they came from, but they thought the Jews should start to believe in Christ. And so they looked at the prophets and they read the books of the Old Testament, and they found references in this that they could interpret as referring to Christ. And so they saw the prophets as prophesying the coming of Christ. And they saw events in what Christians call the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, that they thought foreshadowed or prophesied the coming of various events in the life of Christ. So there was a kind of parallelism, say between, the sacrifice of Isaac, is what they call a type or a prefiguration for the sacrifice of Christ, for example. So they believed that the prophets were the forerunners of Christ, that the prophets were prophesying the coming of Christ, and so they honored them. They see them literally here as the base of Christianity. Let's take a closer look at that figure of Moses. Now, how do we know he's Moses? Well, for one thing, everybody else is holding either a book or a scroll. He has a scroll as well. But he's also holding the tablets of the law. You see this rectangular form that he's holding. And I'll tell you in another minute another way that you can identify Moses, but we'll get into that shortly. Also, I told you these were all painted. The names were originally painted on them, and in some cases you can still read the paint. It's faded, but there it is. So this figure is Moses, holding the tablets of the law, the tablets that had the 10 Commandments, and they very well may have been written on the tablets, or at least abbreviated on the tablets, and maybe. But let's look at the style of the figure. When we look at this figure, we see a weighty figure, a solid figure. And he's wrapped with these voluminous draperies. It really gives you the sense of a real person. Earlier artists and some contemporary artists would have very stylized and beautiful draperies. But this looks like the real stuff, even though it's made out of limestone. And then, if we look closely, we can see that the face is also very naturalistic. You have, wrinkles and sags, and the beard, he doesn't show every single hair, but enough of the texture of the beard so that you get the feeling of locks or tresses. Once again, this looks like a very real person. Now, I want to remind you that these were originally painted. We often use the word polychrome. It means many colors. So this was made out of limestone, and it was painted to look lifelike. And I'm showing you the detail of one of the mourning angels because you can see the paint here. It's protected a little from the elements because it's under the cornice. And I don't know if that's the original paint or if it's, over the years, if they've repainted it, but it's still showing the paint. And you have to imagine that. Now, that would make this look even more lifelike. So we have these solid forms and these naturalistic details, but you also have the color. So they're trying to make these stone statues look very real. In fact, it doesn't survive today, but there's some written records that tell us that one of the prophets, not Moses, but one of the other ones, actually had spectacles. He had little wire-framed glasses. I don't know that they put the glass in it, but for him to read with, I guess, which would make it seem even more real or more lifelike. Now, something I know you've been wondering about, and I skipped over it a little early because I wanted to talk about it specifically, is those bumps on Moses' head. So I'm sure you're asking yourself, why does Moses have horns? And you might think of some other images of Moses. For example, I don't know if you know Michelangelo's statue of Moses in San Pietro in Vincole in Rome, but it also has horns, and there's a reason for it. Now, Michelangelo knew or should have known better, but Sluter probably wouldn't have. Why does Moses have horns? Well, even saints can make mistakes, and it's a translation error. You may know that the Hebrew Bible was first oral tradition, passed down orally, then was written down in Hebrew, and then, at one point, it was translated into Greek, which we call the Septuagint because there were approximately 70 translators. They say not exactly, but approximately 70 translators, so it's called the Septuagint, from the word 70. And that's the Greek Bible. Now, most Christian scholars at this time, I don't think any Christian scholars at this time, around 1400, were reading Hebrew. What they were using in the Western world was the Latin Bible that had been translated by St. Jerome. And he had translated it from the Greek. The part of the Bible that the Christians call the New Testament, that talks about the life of Christ and events following that, that was written in Greek. We think that Christ probably spoke Aramaic, a form of Syrian. But when they wrote it down the literary language of the time, which was Greek. So St. Jerome translated the Greek Bible into Latin. And at the time he did this, the late 4th, early 5th century, Latin was the common language. Rome had conquered much of Europe and the land around the Mediterranean Sea. And so Latin was, the language that just about everybody spoke and read. And then Greek was used by the very well-educated people. So St. Jerome wanted everybody to be able to read the Bible. So he translated into the common language of Latin. Now, the root of the word vulgar, we think of it as, a very negative word, just meant common. Didn't mean, low class and rude and crude the way it does today. The original root was common. So he's translated into the common language, and we call that Bible the Vulgate, from the vulgar or common language of the people. Okay. Jerome is translating from Greek into Latin, and he makes a mistake. Even saints aren't perfect. And in the Bible, it says that when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, after he's spoken to God in the burning bush, and he comes down from the mountain, and it says that there are rays of light streaming from his brow. Except evidently the word for rays in Greek looked a lot like the word for horns. And St. Jerome translated the word rays as horns in Latin. And since the Bible that everybody in the Western world had was St. Jerome's translation, the Vulgate, they would read the Bible and they'd say, well, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he had horns on his brow. And that's why we see Moses in medieval illustrations, and here in Claus Sluter's Well of Moses with horns on his head. Actually, during the Renaissance, humanist scholars learned Greek, and they learned that this was an error, and it's something, for example, that Erasmus of Rotterdam corrected when he created his edition of the Greek Bible. But that's yet to come. At this point, the horns had become an attribute of Moses. If you saw the figure that looked like a prophet with the horns on his head, you know it was Moses. When we start studying early Netherlandish painting, we find that at the very first part of the 15th century, we don't have a lot of panel paintings. There's very few that have survived. And where we go to see what painting was like was in manuscripts. A manuscript is a handwritten book. Manu, from the word for hand, and script for writing, so handwritten. Now, we also use the term the illuminated manuscript, and this actually comes out of the word for the red pigment that sometimes was used to, pick out important words. But illuminated, we use to refer to illustrated manuscripts, manuscripts with pictures in them. Most manuscripts have only words, no pictures. But the ones we're interested in art history classes are the illuminated manuscripts. Now, most manuscripts are written on parchment, which is treated animal skin. The use of paper had died out during the Middle Ages, and it was revived in the later Middle Ages. We're actually going to hear about printmaking later in the class. But most of these manuscripts that have survived were on parchment, which survives much better than paper, certainly. And we're going to look at a particular kind of manuscript. This is a book of hours. And a Book of Hours was a devotional book for lay people. Now, what do we mean by lay people or laity? People who are not, they're people who have not taken religious orders or religious vows. For example, they're not nuns, they're not priests, they're not monks, they're lay people, the ordinary people who do not take religious vows. So what is a Book of Hours? Actually, it is the most popular book of the late Middle Ages or the early Renaissance, the 14th and 15th centuries. There are more surviving manuscripts of this than anything else. Now, what are the characteristics of the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance as far as devotional use? Is that lay people want some of the spiritual benefits that the religious have. So think about it. Priests read their breviary every day. But monks and nuns must participate in the canonical hours, or the divine office, as they call it. Now, what is this? Okay, 8 times during the day and night, monks and nuns have to stop whatever they're doing, or if they're asleep, get out of their bed and go to church. And they have a liturgy. They have readings from the Psalms, readings from the Gospels, responsive prayers. Certainly once a day they would have a Mass. And these are recited throughout the year. For example, they go through the entire Psalter, the entire book of Psalms in a year. And they stop and pray and participate in these services. Now, if you're an ordinary person, you're a cobbler, or you're a duke, or you're a housewife, or you're a goldsmith, you don't have time to stop work 8 times, day and night. You're exhausted from your labors, perhaps. You don't want to get up in the middle of the night and go to church. But you'd like to have some of the same spiritual benefits. So the Book of Hours was created, which essentially is a prayer book or a devotional book that's an abbreviated version of the canonical hours, hence the hours of the divine office. And it has prayers in it. It has responsive readings. So, when you can stop, you can go and maybe every day you can read your Book of Hours. Okay, some people can't read, and books are incredibly expensive. So at first, this is only going to be for the wealthiest people. And manuscripts are only going to be for the wealthiest people. Later on, however, they do start to do printed versions of these, which brings down the price for more ordinary people somewhat. But yes, we're talking about a luxury item here, and yet there are a lot of them. Any book is a luxury item at this time. And what I'm showing you here is an illustration from a later Book of Hours. This is it's a tiny little thing. It'll fit in the palm of one of your hands. So when you see this blow it up, you have to think about the incredible detail and skill of the artist. We don't know the name of the artist. We call him the Master of Mary of Burgundy because he created this and some other books of hours. Some people think he may be Alexander Baining, which is possible, but we don't know for certain. So this is the Book of Hours of Mary of Burgundy, who was the Duchess of Burgundy and died very tragically, as you can see, in 1482 when she was thrown from her horse. And was actually a much beloved ruler. So here she is reading her book of hours. And you see this opening into the church. And you see Mary again kneeling with some of her ladies in waitings and her husband, Maximilian, on the other side, kneeling before the Virgin Mary herself. So as she says the prayers in the Book of Hours, and they're often called the Little Office of the Virgin, because most of them deal with prayers to Mary and about Mary. And then most of them also have things for the Passion of Christ. They'll have, for example, the Mass for the Dead. And they can be customized because these are made, handwritten. So you could, for example, put your favorite saints in them if you wanted to, or some of your favorite responsive readings or prayers. But they can be custom made. And this is from this exquisitely beautiful little manuscript. People did take them to church, and there are some complaints that they'd sit there and read their Book of Hours rather than paying attention to the Mass. So they had pictures. For some of the richer people had books of hours with beautiful pictures to look at. Okay, what's in a Book of Hours? It contains a calendar of saints' days, and that's where we get our word holiday, because these were holy days, and that becomes holiday. It also, as we said, had prayers and readings. They're usually in honor of the Virgin Mary and the Passion of Christ. And it was indeed the most popular book in the 15th century. I'm just showing you here an open page from the manuscript we're going to talk about. The manuscript is called the Très Riches Heures, or the Very Rich Hours, and I'll explain that in a moment. What I just want to do here was show you that you have both text and pictures. Don't think of this as just picture book, even though we'll be showing you pictures. Now, the manuscript painters who painted the Très Riches Heures, the manuscript we're going to look at, are known as the Limbourg Brothers. And their names were Jean or John or Jan, depending on which language you're using. In English would be John. Jan would be Dutch or Flemish. And Jean, spelled like Jean, Jean, would be the French. Paul, which in French is P-O-L, and Herman. Those are the three brothers. And they're very famous manuscript illuminators because they painted a lot of manuscripts for the Duc de Berry, or the Duke of Berry, who was a French duke. He was either the brother or the uncle of the French king, depending on who was, king at the time. And he was, this particular Duke of Berry was Jean, the Duc de Berry, and he was a bibliophile. He loved manuscripts. He loved books. And he had a huge collection. And he had artists that he literally had brought down from the Netherlands, because they were evidently so famous for being excellent artists. And he had them creating many manuscripts for him. Now, we can just give manuscripts numbers, and they do in libraries. But these manuscripts with pictures, we'd like to give them names as well. So they're known by a number of names. For example, some of the manuscripts by the Limbourg Brothers, there's the Beautiful Hours, and the Very Beautiful Hours, and the Rich Hours, and these are the Very Rich Hours. This is one of, if not the most elaborately illuminated manuscript that exists. We can date it fairly close to about 1413 to 16. We know that the Limbourg brothers died in the plague that hit in 1416. And then a later generation had to finish the book. But we're going to look at the Very Rich Hours, or the Très Riches Heures of the Duke of Berry. We're going to look at two of the calendar pages from the Très Riches Heures. And these are pictures of activities of the month, as it were, things that people would do during the month. We call these the labors of the month. And they appear carved on churches and in other manuscripts with calendars. But usually they're little small images without all of these details. There'll be one labor, for example, that might represent the whole month. So these are very elaborate images of the labors of the month. And as you can see, they take up a whole page. So on the opposite page, you would see the list of the saints' days, and then corresponding, you'd have the month. Now, this one is the month of February. And each of these have at the top a zodiac, which we'll be taking a closer look at. And then down below we have what is a pretty naturalistic or realistic scene of people at work at that time of year, in this case in the winter when it's really cold, and you have really a kind of panoramic landscape with people at work. So first let's look at the zodiac. Up at the top, you see an arch that has stars in it, and you see Aquarius, the water carrier, and Pisces, two fish. And they seem to be going around the heavens. And then there's sort of a half circle, what we call a lunette, that features. Let's take a look at it. See what it features. You see what we have here? We have an image of the sun. And it seems to be carried by this man with a crown on what looks like a little house on wheels, almost like a trailer, a gypsy caravan, something like that. And it's pulled by winged horses. You'll notice everything's picked out in gold because this is a very rich book of hours. And they're flying along the sky. Who is this guy? What's going on? Well, this is Apollo or Helios. What? Isn't that a Greek god? Well, by this time they knew some of the stories of the Greek and Roman gods. But when they portrayed them, you might say, in a medieval manner. So they aren't worshiping Apollo. There's no danger of that. Nobody that worships Apollo. But rather than show him, and we think of Apollo, we think of, this nude or almost nude figure with youth with, curly hair and beardless. But here they're showing him as a kind of king, but he's driving a chariot. So they're not showing a true Roman chariot because there aren't any archaeologists and know what a true Roman chariot looks like. As I said, it looks like a little caravan, little house on wheels. And so they're taking that idea of the Greek god, whom is symbolic of the sun, and the chariot of the sun with winged horses pulling it, and showing this as the sun going through the heavens here. So I said, they would have taken this as symbolic, but I wanted to show you that you could have, a Greek god, Greek mythology, and a medieval way of portraying it. And here are just some of the details from that image of the scene of February. You can see that you have the sheep in the sheep cot, which looks like it needs to be repaired. Some grains have been spilled, and so you have some birds coming to eat it. The beehives are dormant. Here's a man, cutting firewood. Look at the whole image. You have someone who's been out working, and he's in a blanket, and he's just huddling there. Someone else who's carrying the firewood on the donkey to the distant town. And then in the lower left, in the lower left, you see the peasants in the house. Now, they've used this device of removing one wall so we can see in it. We're familiar with this from cartoons and stage sets and things like that. It doesn't mean they don't have a wall. It means that, we want to see in. So you see that these peasants seem to be pretty prosperous. They're seated there before a roaring fire. They've got a cat. Their clothes is heavy wool, and they're pulling it up so that the heat can get underneath the garments, and they're hanging up some of the washing on poles. Did the peasants really live that well? Well, probably not most of them. But remember who this is painted for. This is painted for a duke. He is not going to allow or want any pictures of poor, starving peasants doing badly. This is the reality that he wants to create, and I'm quite certain he would not have had a social consciousness in the modern sense. People believe that God put people in the situation where they belonged, and if they were born peasants, they should stay peasants, and if they were born the king, well, that's the divine right of kings. But you're basically going to see pretty prosperous and industrious peasants in this book of Hours. Well, what was it like for the Duke? Well, we have January here, and in January we have the New Year's feast, as it were. We have the Duke and the courtiers feasting. You have another zodiac at the top, this time with I think it's Capricorn and Aquarius again. So, how did the Duke live? Let's look at the January scene. They have scenes both of aristocrats and of peasants. So this is January activities for the Duke. And you can see that he is feasting. It's a great New Year's feast, perhaps. And there is the Duke seated behind the table. And he has, crowds of courtiers and servants to attend on him. Hanging on the wall is a tapestry that shows a battle scene, probably a scene of the Battle of Troy. But once again, everybody is dressed in medieval armor in this tapestry. So they're showing classical stories in contemporary garments. Contemporary guys. So here we're going to look closer at the Duke. He has this fur hat. It is a portrait likeness, a portrait in profile. And he has this great wicker fire screen behind him. So the fire is burning, but he wants to stay warm, but he doesn't want to get too hot. So he's in the preferred place. He's in the preferred place. So he's in the preferred place where he can be close to the fire, but not overly uncomfortable. You might notice that he allows his little dogs to get right up there on the table. And you might wonder what this great vessel shaped like a ship is. That would probably be the salt. Salt was sometimes a very expensive item. It was honored with having, gold or, beautiful vessels. This one very elaborate. And depending on whether you were seated at the table above or below the salt, marked your status. And here you can see one of the servants feeding the Duke's, probably a hunting dog, but obviously a favored one, maybe also an indoor dog too, because he's got this beautiful collar. Either a greyhound or a whippet, something like that. Servant's cutting meat for the dog, who looks very intent. So we have, details of life, everyday life for the Duke, everyday life for the peasants if they were prosperous enough. And so that, gives us this idea of Netherlandish naturalism and detail.